Welcome to Fear Street.
Humankind has been fascinated by the far reaches of outer space for thousands of years, if not more. It's hard to fathom that we're the only intelligent life in this infinitely expanding universe, so it's only logical to question what other beings may reside in the farthest reaches of existence. There are thousands upon thousands of reported UFO sightings, and even abduction stories that range from the creepy to the bizarre. After having my own close encounter in 2010, my mind was blown open. I wouldn't expect a skeptic to believe. I know I didn't. But I do ask that you keep an open mind and enjoy these allegedly true accounts of UFO sightings. In Delphos, Kansas, on the evening of November 21st, 1971, a 16-year-old boy named Ron Johnson was working on his parents' farm. At about 7 o'clock, he was in the sheep pen with his dog. Without warning, he heard a rumbling sound. Like an old washing machine, he told investigators later. He then saw a brightly lit, mushroom-shaped object about 75 feet away. It was hovering a few feet above the ground, glowing with a steady mass of lights, not individual lights. Ron and his dog remained silent, though the sheep began to bellow. The bright lights hurt Ron's eyes. The base of the UFO lit up with even brighter lights, and the craft moved at a 45-degree angle over the hog shed. Ron was blinded by the intense light and heard the UFO zoom away like a jet plane. Moments later, when he was able to see again, he saw the UFO in the southern sky. He ran to the house and told his parents what he had witnessed. With them, he returned to the yard, and they watched the UFO light grow smaller and smaller in the sky. Then, Ron showed them where the UFO had hovered. Even in the darkness of the November night, they could see a luminous gray-white ring. Some nearby trees also seemed to be glowing. The Johnsons touched the soil ring. It was cool and slick. But Mrs. Johnson said that her fingers became numb, and when she wiped her fingers against her pants, her leg also became numb. Both Mr. and Mrs. Johnson experienced prolonged numbness over the next few weeks, while Ron developed headaches and had some eye trouble. He also began to have nightmares. Investigator Phillips checked for other possible witnesses and found none. He also made sure that samples of the glowing soil ring were sent to different laboratories for analysis. Unfortunately, the findings at some laboratories contradicted the findings at others, and the results must be called inconclusive. On Interstate 70, near Indianapolis on March 29, 1978, 3 trucks were traveling together on the highway. The truckers were talking to one another on their CB radios. Suddenly, the trucks were covered with a bright blue light, as if a giant spotlight from the sky was shining on them. The drivers couldn't see beyond the hoods of their trucks, and everything was silent. The CB stopped working, and the engines of the 3 trucks began to run roughly. This lasted for perhaps 5 seconds. Then, the blue light blinked off, and things returned to normal. Road noises, CBs, and engines. The drivers were stunned, but one man announced on his CB, "Hey, UFO? If you have your ears on, I want to go with you." As if someone were listening, the blue light covered the trucks again, this time for 15 seconds. The 3 engines ran into trouble again, and the trucks lurched and slowed to 10 miles per hour. When the light stopped the second time, it didn't return. There were other people who witnessed this strange event as well. A woman who was across the highway told the truckers on her CB that it looked like a big bright blue lampshade over the 3 trucks. On a weekend trip to Boulder, Colorado in 1969, a young member of the Air Force was in bed when his motel room suddenly darkened, followed by a bright flash of light. The next day, he realized his half-inch long hair was now almost 2 inches long, a mystery that his roommate totally freaked out about when he returned to the base in Aurora, Colorado. He wasn't sure what to think of my story, but did realize there was glaring physical evidence, the airman recalled. Though he didn't remember anything else from that night, he speculated in his report that he'd been abducted, and presumably taken to a place where time passes more quickly than it does on Earth. I still have trouble remembering many things, as it's always been very foggy since that time, he said. At about 10 p.m. one summer night in 1971, 2 teenage girls crept from their houses in Sunnyvale, California, and met up for a neighborhood stroll. All was still and silent for an hour or so, until they came upon a 20 to 30 foot flying ship, hovering as low as the streetlights, probably a full 5-minute walk ahead of them. The friends watched it drift towards some nearby apartment buildings, and appeared to survey them, bobbing slightly up and down. It had these great enormous arms on the sides that slowly swiveled around, and they had lines on the ends, like ropes, but they weren't ropes, one of the friends explained in her report. It didn't make noise or light up, and it looked more like wood than metal. She got the impression that it was collecting things, though she couldn't see what was inside. The girls fled in terror when the aircraft abruptly turned its attention on them, and they tried in vain to convince one of their fathers that they had seen something truly extraordinary. He dismissed it and said it was probably just a weather balloon, the witness wrote. If I'm sure of anything, it's that this thing was no weather balloon. On March 15, 1995, the New Fork received an influx of calls across several states from witnesses who saw a bright object flying through the night sky. The first of these so-called Ides of March sightings was reported by 2 men in Florida who described it as luminous, white, and disc-shaped, though subsequent descriptions from others varied. A Tennessee caller thought it was more of a blue-green cloud of light that emitted sparks before vanishing, and a Missouri State Highway Patrol sergeant said it was a green light that turned yellow and suddenly snuffed out like a light being switched off. He also explained that many people called the patrol's 911 dispatch line to report their own sightings, and one person claimed his cell phone and car radio both died when the UFO got close. Other reports came from Virginia, West Virginia, and Missouri. In summary, it appears that one or more egg-shaped objects, radiating intensely bright green, blue-green, and yellow light, and periodically spewing out a cloud of sparks, streaked over at least 7 states, stopping from time to time, and the whole event occurred in a matter of minutes, the New Fork summarized in a case brief. Three foresters were planting seedlings in Washington's mountains when a gently wobbly disc-shaped aircraft appeared and drifted toward a herd of elk. Nearly all the animals fled together, but one set off in a different direction. The UFO positioned itself over the lone elk and beamed it right off the ground, though the observers couldn't discern any visible means of support attached to it. The UFO wobbled more, seemingly struggling with the weight of its prey, and eventually rose so high that the witnesses couldn't see it anymore. They assumed the elk had somehow ended up inside the aircraft. When New Fork director Peter Davenport traveled to Washington to conduct an investigation, he was shown the carcass of a pregnant elk that had been found dead just a few miles from the UFO sighting. As to whether or not that was the same creature that the UFO had supposedly targeted, we'll almost definitely never know. Shortly after 4 a.m. one morning in January 2000, Ed Barton, a police officer in Lebanon, Illinois, heard a dispatch about a strange UFO sighting at a neighboring police station. He looked up and saw the object for himself. Two extraordinarily bright lights that seemed to merge into one even brighter light. He sped off in the object's direction until it was almost overhead, and ballparked its altitude somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 feet. It was triangular, with a light on each corner and many more along one end. The object abruptly shot through the sky so fast that Barton concluded it couldn't possibly have been created by humans. Other Illinois residents witnessed it too. A Millstat police officer named Craig Stevens thought it was between 1 and 2 stories tall, and perhaps 3 stories long. Highland resident Melvin Knoll also likened it to a house. There were big windows, about 2.5 feet wide and 5 or 6 feet high, 2 stories, one on top of the other. He told the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in 2010 that he still believed it was something from another planet. Though a spokesman for the nearby Scott Air Force Base is said to have claimed that the base's radar had been shut off at the time and nobody had seen the UFO, other reports allege that the government was involved. The New Fork received one report from a highly reliable source who said that the Air National Guard jets may have been scrambled to take a look at the object, and several other people even told the New Fork that federal government employees visited police departments and citizen witnesses to ask that they curtail all their statements to the press.